Thanks for joining the Anthony Atias Experience. My name is Anthony Atias. I'm the host of the Anthony Atias Experience podcast. I've got two great guests on here, and I'm really excited to have a great conversation with them. We're going to talk about an organization called Learning from the Future. I've got Dave Newell on the line and Bob Johnson. Of course, they'll touch a little bit about who they are. And then, as always, we want to know about their background, upbringing, and then how they kind of connected. And then, of course, their journey. So I'm super excited to have this conversation. Dave, I'll start with you. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what you're doing now with the company that you're with, and then we'll turn it over to Bob.
That sounds good. Well, thanks for having us. We've been looking forward to this. Appreciate the work that you do as well. My background is I grew up in a rural farming community in the Midwest. I wasn't exposed to really any diversity of any kind growing up. Very much kind of a white homogenous community, but grew up in a family that had really a heart for service and serving other people, which really led me into community organizing in my first kind of career move, and getting exposed to a lot of different ways to unite people, unite communities around a common theme or a common thread, trying to find where are the inroads, how do folks connect, and what do they connect around, and then really kind of leading that charge and starting there. Currently run a company called Evolve Leadership Consulting, which is small business consulting, essentially organizational development work, and then do this work with Bob with Learning from the Future, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what that looks like and how that works. But yeah, I'll kick it over to Bob at this point.
Right.
All right. Well, Anthony, same here. It's really great to be with you today. Thanks for inviting us to be a part of your show. I grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, a little town down on the coast of North Carolina, southeastern coast of North Carolina, and actually my training and background is a technical one. I was a chemist by training. Worked for 25 years with the Dow Corning Corporation up in Midland, Michigan, and moved down to Charlotte, North Carolina with another company called the Hearst Celanese Corporation. And through that, began to realize that technical stuff is okay, but you can't really move ideas forward unless you figure out how to connect with people. So began to understand that people connection, and started asking, so how do we make that happen? Started to learn and study some tools and techniques, and began to move out of that area into more of a people connection facilitation area. Started to enjoy that more than I did working in the laboratory. So, what we're doing now with the Learning from the Future piece is more of a community facilitated dialogue that Dave and I are a part of. And I'm enjoying that a lot more than I ever did working at a lab bench all by myself.
Okay. Well, no, that's great. It's interesting. Both of you came from, it seems, fairly small towns. I am curious on the connection. How did you guys kind of connect? How did you guys get together?
Well, I guess I'll start. So we have a mutual friend, Astrid Chirinos at the time. I'm not sure Astrid just got married. I don't know her married name. I'm ashamed of that. But anyway, so Astrid actually brought us together. Dave invited Astrid to go to a session called The Art of Hosting out in Minnesota. And she could bring one guest, and she invited me to go with her. So I went, and it was a several day experience. And, Dave had already been a part of that, and we connected through that and began to realize that, hey, we've got some similar values. some similar ideas, and we started just playing with, so what in the world would happen if we put some of these things together? So that's been, what, 5 years, 6 years now, Dave, something like that?
Yeah, I think we met in 2018. And, just to kind of echo what Bob was talking about in terms of some of those similar interests, our backgrounds, as we kind of denoted already, are quite different. But, the art of hosting and a lot of the background that I have in community organizing and organizational development is about working in complex systems and how to increase conversation, engagement, voice, and connectedness through those. And a lot of Bob's background is in is in chemistry and structure. And so there's this kind of fluidness to the conversation and getting voice, and then there's this, kind of structured, organized process part of it. And so our two approaches complement each other well to create a fairly unique experience. And I think in our initial engagements together, we recognized, that what we could do alone isn't quite as good as what we could do together.
Mm-hmm.
And that shared value piece just kind of invited us into exploring, well, what would it look like if, we joined forces and started facilitating some of these sessions together? What impact could we have? And so I think both of us are experimental by nature, in that we just kind of got into it and started noodling and started inviting people into conversations, and then found that we had something, and then kind of took it from there.
I like that, experimental by nature.
Yeah,
like that.
that's funny. Is I had a guy, who used the phrase, "Hey, if you're not living on the edge, you're probably taking up too much space." I think Dave and I both enjoy sort of living on the edge of things and
Yeah.
seeing where it goes, not necessarily knowing what the end looks like when we start the journey, but we enjoy the journey.
No, that's great. Um, so when you talk about community, I think that's so important. Do you think community is still there, or are people almost like living in their own worlds? Like, how do you bring people together who may have different backgrounds, different thoughts? You have things like social media that just really, to a certain extent, good or bad, can change people's view on certain things. The community piece, how do you make sure that that's still center? How do you bring people together?
Yeah, I think there's probably a really basic answer to that question, and then maybe a little bit more kind of meta, complicated philosophical answer to that question. I think the really basic answer to that question is through questions, essentially, right? Which is, we really ascribe to the philosophy that questions are more transforming than answers, and that what people are craving and probably lacking right now is being asked questions and then being listened to, and then for that thread to be repeated back and to be heard, and to say, hey, here's what we heard you saying, and now let's find the common ground between what you said and what this other person said. And now, as opposed to being divisive and opinionated and giving answers, it's, well, that question led to some interesting insights and some curiosity. Now let's ask another question, and let's ask another question. And as you invite that community into conversation, or you invite those people into conversation, they realize that they're more similar than they are different. And those similarities is where those threads come. And so, we use this quote often by Anne Linnea, and she says, the shortest distance between two people is a story.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we do in this process is we invite people to share their stories. So, the practical version is we lead with questions, and we ask questions, and we listen. But I do think it is really about hearing and being heard and finding common ground, as opposed to, focusing on the differences or focusing on what we don't have in common. It's like, well, that's fine, but let's start with kind of where we are, who we are. Let's find those inroads and build from there, and continue to pursue, even when we think we found the answer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So I'll just add and say, the way that we help people feel like they're being heard, as Dave said, is we invite them to tell their story. But then in the processes that we use, we capture that story, and then we tell them back the story that we think that we've heard. So, so many times people are sort of talking, but you're never quite sure whether or not you're connecting or they're connecting with the listener. In the tools that we use, we try to be good active listeners, and then we reflect the story back to the individual, as opposed to trying to respond to their story. We simply want them to know that we've heard your story, and this is what we think it is. Is that an accurate story? Are we correct? Do you need to say something more so that we can better understand it, or just what does it look like? But to get back to your basic question, I think community is still there. I'm not so sure that people have a full appreciation for community in the way that it exists. It's almost community is almost an underground relationship, with the with the tools that we have now, social media and what have you. We often call that community, but there's nothing that beats sitting down across from a person and literally having, or groups of people, and having an open conversation. The response that we get at the end of our sessions is always, boy, this feels so liberating. I can't forget, I can't begin to tell you how good it felt to be able to share that. We had a session just last week with a group, and they were saying, we never, as a group, had a chance to sit down and have these conversations. So it's there. We just need to resurface it and not lose the impact of it.
No, that's great. Something my dad always used to say to us was, listen to understand versus listen to respond. And it's always stuck with us. And you just touched on it as well, Bob. So learning from the future, because I thought the name was really interesting, because typically you hear about learning from the past. So I'm curious on how you came up with that name and what this organization means.
Okay. So it's a takeoff on a phrase that Benjamin Franklin used. And Ben Franklin simply said that experience is a very expensive university. And he's right. There's nothing wrong with learning from experience. Everybody wants to learn from experience so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. But if we're always only learning from our experience, then we guarantee that learning comes at the highest possible price. So we began asking ourselves, so what if we had some ways of not just exploring or telling our stories of the past, but begin to ask ourselves, so what path are those stories putting us on? We have a phrase that we use that says, we're always on the road to somewhere, even when we think we're standing still. So our actions and our decisions are always putting us on that road, but we don't often ask ourselves, so where is this taking us? What does that emerging future look like? We are creating some version of that future. And if we can begin to ask and explore what that potentially looks like, I mean, it's not going to be perfect, but at least it's sort of like using the things you're doing now as not as a crystal ball to see into the future, but as a crystal ball to magnify the decisions that you're making and see where those things are taking us. And if it turns out that your response is, well, I'm not so sure this is where I want to be, then you can ask, so what do I need to do to adjust that trajectory? If it turns out that it is where you want to take you, then by all means, go for it. So we simply wanted to help people to change or adjust their way of potentially learning and beginning to jump out there and realize the path that they're on, where it's taking them, and asking, so is that the future that we really want to emerge?
Well, no, that's great. As we've been talking, one thing that kept standing out was story, and I think that's really the basis of this podcast, is people's stories and people's journeys. and finding that connection. What does your sessions look like when you have people who have different backgrounds, have different stories, have different experiences? How do you navigate through that? I know, of course, the listening piece is important, but sometimes people come with a wall because I've been like this for 45 years. How are you going to tell me how to uh, act or listen? What are some of the things that you guys go through when you do your sessions?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is where some of those practices that we've talked about, or some of the methodologies that we apply, are really about how do we create the conditions in a room or in a space for folks to feel like they can share their story and be heard, right? And so, we often start sessions with our own story, a little bit about kind of how we got to where we were going. We give an anecdote, and then we ask two questions. We say, what are you carrying into this conversation, and what do you hope to get out of it? And they're safe questions, right? It's just, what do you want to get out of it? Like, what are outcomes for you? But as they tell those stories, or as they share what they're sharing, we capture that, we write it down, and we repeat it back to them. And we ask the question, what did you hear each other saying? And what we're doing is we're inviting them into this process in a non-vulnerable, not in a overly vulnerable, we're not asking you to share your personal opinions about politics or race or whatever. It's just, what do you as an individual hope to get out of this conversation? But that act of speaking or answering a question, speaking, being heard, having it repeated back, and then listening for what's taking place in the room, I think is the basis for the rest of the experience. It's a microcosm of what we're asking them to do throughout the rest of the sessions. And I will say, you can almost see the room settle after you have that initial conversation. It's almost like the tension releases and they feel connected, and we're sitting in circle and we're facing each other, and there's no tables in front of anybody, right? It's just this very open space. So I think at the outset, we create the conditions for sharing, being heard, listening for the weave of information that follows through. And then the rest, there's essentially 3 sessions. Session 1 is us asking really one question. And as the group answers and responds to that question, there's no right or wrong answer. There's just their story, right? So we're not saying, well, I don't know, I don't agree with that. Like, we never say that. We say, hey, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. Or, can you help clarify what you mean by X, Y, or Z? And so we're just, each one of those pieces is essentially a data point. And those data points then start to show us a collection. They start to present themes, and they start to show like, oh, okay, so here's the larger narrative that's taking place. So I'm going to steal Bob's analogy a little bit. So sorry, Bob. Jump in and steal back if you want as I start sharing this. But, we talk about a dot map analogy, right? Essentially of, if you go 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, all of a sudden the image starts to emerge. And maybe you had an idea of what that image was beforehand, but you couldn't see it clearly until you connected those dots. And essentially that's what we're doing in this exercise, is we're saying each person comes in with a series of dots, right? And what we're doing is we're just saying, well, what are your dots? And what are your dots? And what are your dots? And as we put those dots together, we say, hey, okay, this is the image that's emerging. Now we're starting to see this picture. And I think once you get to that place with a group, the guard gets let down a little bit. Session 2 then is us saying, as Bob was kind of alluding to earlier, here's your story. Here's what we heard you saying. Here's the image that was created based on the dots that you gave us, right? And then session 3 is actually bridging, in organizations, it would be kind of pulling teams together or departments together to talk about, they're engaging across different, so to speak. In communities, it is bringing multiple different communities together, but each one of them has gone through session 1 and session 2 where they're equipped with their story. And so what we've done then is by session 3, we've created the basis for folks to engage and find similarities and find common threads. They're not walking into that conversation, unequipped, so to speak. Bob, I talked for a long time. What did I miss? Sorry for stealing the dot map analogy.
Yeah, that's perfect, Dave. That's perfect. The thing that the people often ask says, so what's the answer? you know, and as Dave was describing how we initially get into this, we try to create a safe space for people to just explore the question. We aren't looking for an answer. When you push for answers, it's either going to be the right answer or the wrong answer. And when you're doing that, then you're encouraging people to pull back a little bit. They're afraid to share because what if my answer is not the right answer, or whatever. So we try to create a space where they're willing to just explore the statement, explore the question from their point of view. In fact, we're realizing, and we hope that they begin to realize, that they come from different backgrounds, they come from different communities, they have different mental models of what the world is supposed to be like or is like, and we encourage them to simply share their thoughts, realizing that their thoughts are being shared on the basis of their own past and their own experience. Doesn't make it right, doesn't make it wrong. As I always say, it's kind of like noses. Everybody has one. Some are just cuter than others, but everybody's got one. But if we can create a safe space so that people can simply share how they see it and allow other people to hear how you see it or other people see it, you begin to, we hope, understand that there are some connections here that maybe we didn't think about before we came into the room.
Dave, you talked about data points and kind of building out that narrative. If we take a step back, what would you say is the overall narrative that you're seeing from different organizations that you've worked with? Is it a common narrative, or is every organization different? Like, what are you seeing out there as you kind of track these data points?
Yeah, and I'll definitely let Bob speak to this as well. I think we're seeing one thing in particular, but each community, each group we talk to, each organization we talk to has nuance and uniqueness to their story, right? How they get to a place might be a little different, or how they perceive a place might be a little different, but there's some common themes that are pulling up. And I think one thing that I think is really grounding for us and justifying for us is one common thread across most is that they're kind of stuck in superficial conversations. And so what we see is really a pathway to engagement in an organization, or a pathway to feeling more connected as a community, or a pathway to solving some of the issues, or at least addressing some of the issues that we see, not just across our society, but in our organizations, is having meaningful conversation, right? And, superficial means we say the thing that, we don't necessarily go beyond the surface level, or we hide behind outcomes, or we hide behind, yeah, but we got to get something done. And it's like, there's nothing wrong with outcomes. There's nothing wrong with getting something done, but there's some steps to take before that to actually understand, well, what do we actually need to do? Like, what are some of these root causes? What are some of these leading indicators that affect some of these things that we talk about and that we care about? And you can only get there if you get into conversations with people that are deeper, that are meaningful, that talk about the things that people genuinely care about, and not in a way of, getting to those conversations from a judgment place, but doing it from curiosity. We say judgment and curiosity cannot exist at the same time. And what that means is we are naturally judgmental as people. That's good. That's a safety mechanism. That's our lizard brain saying, stay safe. We're constantly looking around our environment to figure out how do we stay safe. But when we are in these conversations and we lead from a place of judgment, now we're actually creating a separateness as opposed to a connectedness, which is what curiosity allows for. So if, to move beyond superficial conversations is to say, hey, I'm gonna remove judgment for this period of time. As I'm in this conversation, I'm gonna choose curiosity. So even if I think, wow, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, instead of me saying, hey, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, I might say, hey, I don't see it from the same perspective. Can you help me understand where you're coming from? So those are two very different responses to the same statement. One is inviting and connecting and deepening, and the other is, distancing, removing, and disconnecting. So I really only touched on superficial conversations. I know, Bob, you have more to add and more context as well.
Yeah, so it's interesting that as you're talking, Dave, so I'm realizing that superficial conversations is probably the most common area that surfaces, regardless of what kind of group you're working with. So we have we've done this with um, corporate organizations. I mean, we both have our own private clients. I've got a medical group down in Atlanta. We've got all kinds of groups. But with every one of those groups, what the process allows them to do is move beyond superficial conversations so that they can really have a meaningful discussion about what's real. I mean, we all know when you meet someone, what kind of things to talk about, what's your name, who are you from, who are your folks, all that kind of stuff. And we can talk for a long time without really getting to anything meaningful. But if you can really get down to stuff that's meaningful, then you can start to move the needle and address the real elephant that's in the room. In our work in Charlotte together, the question or the statement that we are playing with or we put out with groups is about race and race relations. So you might imagine that certainly when people start talking about that, you start with a superficial conversation about certain things, but we know that we can never really identify true change makers or opportunities for making change until and unless we can get down below that surface piece. When it comes to race, there are two or three others that seem to keep popping up. Superficial conversations is probably the first. And then you've got privilege. Privilege is an interesting one. And we don't use the term white privilege, though people want to kind of pull us there. But privilege is just one of those things that everybody has, regardless of who you are. I mean, at your house, you get to do certain things. And when I come to your house, I have to abide by your rules. That's the privilege that you have. So we all have privilege. It's just that in our neighborhoods, privilege takes on a different set of meanings. So when it comes to race and race relations, privilege often means that certain groups get to determine what's important and what's not. Certain groups get to determine what we talk about and what we don't talk about. So privilege is another one of those. And then you've got systemic racism, that it does exist. And again, what I'm describing are patterns that we have seen over the last 3 or 4 years. So it's not stuff that Dave and I have put out there. It's just that as people talk about these things, these are the patterns that come up. So systemic racism, that there are just systems in place designed to keep certain people who are on top, and certain people who you feel like might be challenging you from being on top, keeping those people at bay. So those things are there. And then the fourth one is that those three pieces tend to then shape the community, where we live, or where we can choose to live, or the quality of life where we live. So when it comes to race and race relations, those four things seem to keep popping up. So with the groups dealing with other issues, like I said, I've got a medical group, and they were talking about so how do we make sure that we give access to poor people in the community? Well, you got to start with a superficial conversation, moving beyond that to truly understand. So what do we mean by poor people? and how does that show up? And then they've got all their other pieces. So it's kind of interesting that the patterns seem to emerge depending upon the question that you're asking. Keep asking that question to different groups in any organization, in any industry, and you begin to see that there's some patterns that exist here. And what we try to do is simply help groups begin to see what those patterns are. What picture begins to emerge when you start to connect those dots. And once you can see the picture, then you can ask yourself, so where do we start making a difference? If you can't see the picture, then you're going to, move towards something that is kind of your knee-jerk reaction based on your background that may address your needs, but may not help anybody else. But if you can begin to see what that larger picture looks like, you can begin to make some systemic changes or ask, where's the best leverage in order to make the most systemic change?
Absolutely. Bob, you're still a chemist at heart. You know that, right? Like you're bringing all these pieces together. You're still a chemist at heart.
I confess I do have these lapses from time to time, Anthony.
No worries. Okay, so I do have one more question for y'all. Well, actually, two more. One being, when you go in these sessions, you talk about, Dave. You talked about session 1, 2, 3. Give me an example, like of some sessions that you had where what was the outcome? Like, what does success look like for you guys when you go in and do these sessions, when folks are having these superficial conversations, and after you do the sessions, like what is the outcome been? Just an example.
Yeah, I'd say that the core outcome is that the community gets to insight around what kind of leads to the things that they see as pain for themselves. So one of the things that we often, where we know in advance and we often see in these conversations, is that the things that folks start with are the things that they can tangibly see. Like, they're the outcomes, they're the outputs. It's like, the education system is broken, housing costs are too high, et cetera, et cetera. There's not enough affordable housing. Like, you'll hear these kind of concrete things. And, when I think we have a really successful group is when we hear those things and then we continue to dig in and we continue to get clarification and we get more stories and more elements. And what we realize is like, well, there's something in front of that is making that possible. And I can say with kind of full clarity that I don't think there's a group that we've engaged that hasn't had an aha moment around just, oh my gosh, it's that. Like, that's the thing that's kind of leading to all this other stuff. And they start to see the connection between the things that they talk about, right? They start to see the connection and the relationship between things. And I think that's the powerful part, right? Is when you feel stuck or you feel disconnected or you feel disengaged, these one-off things, these symptoms, you're dealing with symptoms, and what you're not doing is saying, well, how do these symptoms fit together and what's the disease? Because you likely don't have the capacity or the full story or whatever, maybe to see it on your own. And sometimes just having somebody help you peel back the layers of the onion to say, hey, all of these symptoms are telling us a bigger story about what the disease is, right? And I think a successful group for us is when we get to the point where we can say, hey, it's these core things. Like, this is what's leading to the things that you're talking about. And then they get to discover that for themselves. And then that group gets to decide, we don't decide this for them, but what this group gets to decide is, well, what do we want to do about it? Who do we want to be now that we know this, right? We use this anecdote on the front end, and this is from a commencement speech that David Foster Wallace gave. And he said, there's this old fish swimming by two younger fish. And the older fish says, hey, boys, how's the water? And the younger fish say, water? What the heck is water? Right? It's the thing that they've been swimming in their whole lives, but they didn't know it, right? And so, that's kind of the anecdotal version of saying, that's we share that on the front end. We essentially say, like, look, we want to help you discover what you're swimming in. Like, here's your water, and now that you know it's water, you can't unknow that, you can't unsee that, but it frees you up to have choice to how you want to interact with it. Right. So what insight leads to is the ability to make new choices. It doesn't mean you're going to make that choice, but it leads to the ability to make different and new choices. You might decide, you know what, I'm going to keep swimming the way I've always swam, even though I know it's water. Or you might say, hey, now that I know it's water, I don't want to swim like that anymore. I want to swim like this. And that just opens up the possibility for new choices because they got to an insight.
Yeah. No, that's great. And the last question, you just talked about choices. Obviously, you guys made a great choice to connect together and build something out. What would you say you're most proud about when it comes to learning from the future?
So that's kind of a version of what does success look like, and I'll add another story to what Dave just added. So for me, I am really proud when people in the group discover that they have a capacity to make a difference. For so many sessions, people go into, diversity sessions and things like that. It's always them and us, they're saying this about us and all that kind of stuff. But in our sessions, we often have a situation where people realize, hey, that's the difference that I can make. We had one person who a few years back, they were going through one of our sessions and we got into the whole education thing. And she said, why don't I run for school board? And she ran and she won. So she's out there making the difference that we're just kind of talking about in general terms in that meeting, because she's beginning to see herself in that picture, that she can make that difference. And when people see that, for me, I'm really feeling good about it. We've had other groups who have gone out and they've gotten grants to help various parts of their community as a result of some of the discussions that we've had, and who started businesses and things of that nature. So I really like the idea that people can see themselves in the picture making the difference that they're talking about.
No, that's great. I like that, the capacity to make a difference. What about you, Dave?
Yeah, I'd say the pieces that I'm proud about, similar to Bob, is what we see is relationships that didn't exist before that then become opportunities to continue a non-superficial conversations, right? So we've had groups from all over Charlotte. I mean, 25, 26 different communities that we've talked to at this point in time, along with the organizations and groups that we work with. And what we find is you change the nature of the conversation and you build relationship around things that matter. Folks start reaching out to each other, and there's almost like a spiraling effect. Like, we can't predict on the front end, oh, it's going to lead to this outcome. All we can do is have these conversations, and then these outcomes start to show up. People, we use the phrase, people buy into what they create. And it's like the more story they have, the more the connection that they have, they'll say, hey, you know what? I would have never engaged with this person who lives in, whatever part of town, or I would have never engaged with this person who works in this department. But now that we've had this kind of meaningful conversation, they reach out to each other, and then they start to find interesting ways to work together. And then that catalyzes the next movement. Not to use the butterfly effect kind of framing, but essentially that's what it is. Like, this catalyzes relationships and connections that turn into a web of things that we never could have predicted, all moving towards connection and addressing these systemic problems.
That's great. This is really, really, I could just keep talking to you guys. It's a takeaway was that you do have the capacity to make a difference. Dave, you talked about the importance of community. So I really appreciate you guys coming on here. I think it really expanded and elevated what the conversation would look like, going beyond the superficial conversations. So I appreciate it. Hopefully we'll have a part two, because like I said, I definitely enjoyed talking to both of you, and I really learned a lot, and hopefully the audience would learn a lot as well. Any parting words before we wrap up?
I'll just thank you. I will say, if you're interested in having one of these conversations in either your community or your organization, you can check out learningfromthefuture.info. And we've got ways to connect with us and on the website there. And you can also see the results of some of the conversations that we've been a part of. You can look at some of the different conversations, some of the different, kind of outputs from the conversations that we've had, and you can start to see yourself and other people's stories just by looking at the website and connecting that way. But we are really driven by, in many ways, a community champion is probably the term I would use for it, is somebody who says, hey, I think it would be really important for our group to have this conversation. Well, if you're one of those people, absolutely connect with us, and we can kind of help you steward a community connection, or even within your organization, pulling your team together or pulling a department together or whatever it might be. I would just say, if you feel any inkling of any kind, the real bravery, the first step is just do something, take an action, and then we can help you from there.
Absolutely. Appreciate that. Learningfromthefuture.info. I'll definitely put that website in when we put it out in the podcast and YouTube world. Like I said, I definitely appreciate speaking with you guys. Bob, did you have anything?
Well, I would just echo what Dave has said. We are, as we go through this process, we're realizing that, as we call it, the background continues to change. That is, the things that are happening out there politically and socially and demographically, all those things are continuing to change. So as we have our discussions, as we said earlier, we aren't necessarily looking for an answer, because we realize that we can simply play the things that we come up with against the background that we're dealing with for now. So we encourage people to be willing to continue to explore what those next steps might look like, keeping the question on the table even after you think you have identified a solution that seems to be working for you now. Because we know that all those things, demographics, the economy, all those things are going to continue to change. So even the solutions that you think are working now will probably need to be adjusted in the future. So we'd love to have conversations with you. Let's see where it takes us. Great.
Well, Bob Johnson.
And lastly, thank you for having us on. This felt like a generative conversation. So thanks for engaging us in questions. We really appreciate that.
No, I definitely appreciate you guys as well. Dave Newell and Bob Johnson, learningfromthefuture.info. Thanks for joining the podcast, and hopefully we'll connect soon. Have an excellent day.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.